Hello and welcome back to Tongue-Tied Tales episode 4, the podcast where we tell the untold tales of teaching English abroad. This episode is focused on my own experiences in Japan, the superhero charisma man, hopeless romantics and kids doing unspeakable things with scissors. First, let's briefly recap. Last episode we looked at the rise of Nova to become Japan's #1 English language school. We saw how company founder Chairman Nozu became celebrated in Japan before becoming increasingly autocratic and detached from the day-to-day running of the company. We also saw how Nova began to court controversy by not respecting foreign teachers' rights and by selling students overpriced packs of lessons that could often not be used, among other dodgy deeds. Recap over, and now it's time to tell my own story of how it was to work in the McDonald's of the English teaching world. When I arrived in Japan, which I covered in episode 2, I was a typical Nova teacher, 21 years old and straight out of university. Like all Nova teachers, I was sent for teacher training. Mine was in the city of Okayama, one of the largest cities in the western Shikoku region of the main Honshu island. The training was only a few days long. I travelled up the night before training started to stay in one of Japan's famous capsule hotels for the first time. As a taller person, I struggled to fit into my rectangular coffin-shaped capsule and remember being able to hear everything the people sleeping above, below and next to me in the adjoining capsules were doing. Maybe with earplugs it would have been okay. At least the bento breakfast was pretty good. I remember walking into the large Nova Academy in Okayama dressed in my badly fitting suit and tie. The academy had 30 to 40 teachers, giving around 20 classes at any one time, compared to the tiny corner of the mall 6-teacher academy I was used to. It was huge. After going to reception, I was sent to a large training room where a group of about 10 new Nova teachers sat waiting for the head trainer. After a while, a slight pale and sickly looking man came to the front of the room. "Hi everyone, my name is Weber and this will be your Nova training." Weber, a Canadian who had been 8 years with the company, was a true Nova zealot with an almost religious respect for Nova. He left us with the clear message that here, Quest is everything and you should follow the lessons exactly. Quest being the fairly outdated and dry American textbook series we were supposed to have all our lesson plans based on. To be honest, Weber bored us nearly all to death. He was one of a relatively few foreigners who stayed at Nova long enough to try and make a career out of it. Finally, we trainee teachers all got to do a short mock English lesson of our own and got to observe each other too. I watched an Irish lad called Dermot give a class to 4 Japanese teenagers. It was hard to take much from the class. Every time Dermot spoke in his strong sing-song Southern Irish accent, the girls just started giggling uncontrollably with their hands over their mouths. They couldn't understand a word and poor Dermot left red-faced. I learned from this to moderate my own accent, which had an Essex twang back then. "Alright Darren, let's get some apples and pears from the market, innit?" In Japan, the American accent is usually preferred, and so we British and Irish teachers tried to make our accents more neutral in order to keep our students, especially lower level ones, happy. Before I knew it, the 2-day training was over and I was told I was ready to teach full time as a new teacher. To celebrate, Weber kindly invited some of us back to his apartment in Okayama. It was a small place with posters of sci-fi movies, especially The Matrix and Neo, all over the walls. After a drink or two of sake, Weber suggested, "How about going out for dinner?" After a short walk to a nearby economiyaki, we were all settling down on the floor to eat. Suddenly, an incredibly beautiful Japanese girl walked in and approached Weber and kissed him briefly. Yes, his girlfriend. We were all a bit shocked. Nani? In early 1998, this trend inspired a comic book superhero in Japan called Charisma Man. The character was created by Larry Rodney, a young Canadian author working in Japan, and quickly gained popularity among the gaijin community there. The Charisma Man comics followed the adventures of a young Western man who lacked power and status back in his home country of Canada. In Canada, Charisma Man could often be found working doing a low-level job, like flipping burgers in McDonald's, while his face was full of unhappy insecurities, and his physical stature was weak and weedy looking. He was often bullied and constantly romantically rejected by Western women. But one day, our young hero chose to leave it all behind and travel to Japan, where the moment he stepped off the plane and came into contact with Japanese women, he became Charisma Man. He immediately transformed into a handsome, strong, and shining Japanese babe magnet. Wherever he went, he was the center of attention, and women laughed at his terrible jokes and fell into his arms easily. But, like Superman, Charisma Man also had his kryptonite, as, if by chance a Western woman ever entered the same place as Charisma Man, he would immediately lose all his powers and visibly shrink to become insecure and weak again. And many young Nova teachers came to Japan precisely because of this Charisma Man effect. The most extreme example I saw of this was of Mac, an American Nova teacher I spoke briefly of in episode 2. In my time working with him, Mac kept getting complaints from female students for making them feel uncomfortable in lessons. Mac was known to wolf whistle and ring his bicycle bell at Japanese schoolgirls as they passed in the street. I remember not long after I arrived at the academy, I saw him staring at me in the staff room, and then out of nowhere he called me a "swami British bastard." But Mac took his inner Charisma Man to the next level by attaining an online certificate to say he was a Christian priest. This allowed Mac to perform marriage ceremonies in churches for Japanese Christians who made up a tiny minority of the population. We would imagine these poor couples being married by Mac simply because, as a tall blonde white guy, he fit the image some Japanese people had of how a marriage ceremony should look. And what about me? Was I a Charisma Man? I'd recently graduated from studying English and history, and I was a bookish yet sporty young guy who hadn't had any girlfriends so far, but I do remember having a crush on a Japanese girl at my Nova Academy. Aki was her name. She was in her 20s and had dyed orangey red hair. She worked in a hair salon and was very bright and chatty in our classes, but I was too shy to ask if she had a boyfriend or anything. I was also worried about Nova's no student fraternization policy, which could on paper get me sacked should I socialize with any students outside of classes, if you remember. Even so, after a few months teaching, Aki mentioned she lived in a small village a few miles away from where I lived. We even met outside the academy in her car, after she invited me, having seen me cycling in the cold winter weather of 2003. But I never thought of asking her out on a date, much less anything else. Instead, maybe a week after Aki had told me where she lived, I was sitting at home one night, and just randomly decided to try to walk to Aki's village in the cold. I used a paper map to guide myself as I walked in the freezing night air. After walking maybe 1.5 hours, I eventually arrived in the village shivering. There, I found a small restaurant to warm up in. I just stood in the entrance and got a few curious stares from customers inside, before I then bumbled around the largely empty, dark and silent streets of the village for a while. Puzzled, I began my long walk home. The next day I went down with cold and fever for the rest of the week. I really don't know what I expected or why I had not thought to tell Aki of this plan. Looking back, I guess I had read too many King Arthur type stories growing up of noble heroes going on adventures where they had to suffer to win their lady's favour. And so, long story short, there was no happy ending for my romance, and my lessons with Aki stopped soon after she moved away, and I never saw her again. Yet I wasn't the worst or the only hopeless romantic in my Nova Academy. There was also Megumi. I remember well the first time I got to teach Megumi. I was in the teacher's staff room preparing for my classes, and Shane, my Aussie boss, was looking at my schedule. "Oh, so Dick, you're the lucky one who gets to teach Megumi." "I think I do." "Why is she alone in the class?" I replied, still trying to ignore the fact that the Aussies at Nova were trying to call me Dick all day long, a traditional old nickname for Richard. "Well, she pays for all seats, mate, to make sure she is alone." "That must be expensive," I said. "Yep, it's because she wants to talk about Adam Sandler all day long." There was no time to ask Shane anything else as the long lesson bell chime rang for the next Nova lesson. I got up, curious to meet Megumi. What kind of student paid for all the seats? And only to talk about Adam Sandler movies? Adam Sandler being a well-known Canadian actor. As I drew near the classroom, I could see a serious-looking young Japanese woman in maybe her early 30s with long black hair and thick, round, large glasses sitting bolt upright alone in the room. Once I entered, Megumi bowed her head to the table very quickly, hitting it quite loudly before snapping her head back again. The momentum of the movement caused the back of her head to again hit the wall behind her as well, this time more lightly, thank heaven. I got used to this as a sign of respect from Japanese students to their teachers, but I was unnerved by how exaggerated Megumi's bowing was as I sat down and introduced myself. Megumi told me she worked in the clothing section of the department store on the floor below the Nova Academy in the same mall. Once introductions were over, I moved my hand automatically to open my Nova Quest textbook for the usual planned lesson. At that moment, Megumi gently put her hand over the book. "No lesson, only talking, please," she said. I was surprised as someone new to teaching, but after 10 minutes felt relieved and interested to listen to Megumi, who, exactly like Shane had said, began to talk in great detail about an Adam Sandler movie she had seen last weekend called Little Nicky. It's a comedy about demons from hell invading New York City. All I had to do was politely ask her questions to show interest and maybe teach the odd bit of vocabulary. Even though she was talking about comedy movies, Megumi always sounded quite serious and intensely focused on the plot details. After some more lessons talking about 2 more Adam Sandler movies, she invited me to talk about myself a bit, as she told me that when I said I was from England, she only knew about Mr. Bean, the Queen, and David Beckham. As I got to know her, Megumi explained things about herself, saying that she didn't believe in showing emotions, as this was how she had been raised, and how Japanese should be in public. Later on, I also found out the real reason why Megumi spoke so much about Adam Sandler. It wasn't just because she loved the movies, but because she had fallen in love at the Nova Academy. There had been a Canadian teacher called Brian working there once, who had dated Megumi. But then he left Nova suddenly while promising to return for her. Brian had looked a lot like Adam Sandler, and Megumi never gave up hope that he would return, coming back to the academy every week. Classes with students like Megumi were much better than those with surly teenagers who didn't talk much. In those classes it was like trying to get water from a stone for 45 minutes. I remember asking one particularly quiet teenage boy, "Why are you even here?" "Because my parents send me." It was challenging for young and untrained teachers like me. In my first month at Nova, I remember planning at night, often worried about the next day's classes. But once I got into the swing of it, most Nova lessons were fun. You just walked into the room with your Quest textbook, often finding 4 randomly thrown together Japanese people with a similar English level sitting around that horseshoe-shaped table. You did your best to teach them some English while making sure they had fun. As the type of Japanese person who usually came to Nova was more open-minded than average, you got to have some wonderful conversations. But let's not forget, Nova had 2 other lesson types apart from the general one. These were kids' lessons and the voice room. The kids' lessons, which I usually took once a day, were my most dreaded of all Nova lessons. The young learners were between the ages of 3 and 6, and Nova Academies had a special kids' room for them. The floor inside was padded with thick and soft carpet and alphabet tiles, and the walls covered with colourful patterns and posters. Of course, there was a big stuffed Nova Usagi toy rabbit and colouring crayons to complete the lunatic asylum feel. Before each kid's lesson, I had to take off my shoes and tuck in my tie. I would then take a deep breath and enter the room with the kids who had often been roaming the mall with their parents before the lesson. My kids' lessons always seemed to be just after lunch, around 2 p.m. So the kids would show up after having lunch at the mall, which was usually a McDonald's, so they came into the room juiced up and hyperactive. One positive thing was that I wouldn't be able to think of anything else for the next 45 minutes. We would play games that had them running around the small classroom to deal with all their energy. We'd sing songs. As any teacher of very young children will know, you have to change activity every few minutes to keep young children interested, even more so if they are high on sugar and caffeine. I really struggled. The kids, who let's not forget were from a small town in Japan, had also often never seen or interacted with one of the big-nosed white foreigners before, and would act by getting even more excited and treating you a bit like a clown, or occasionally being a bit scared of you. One 4-year-old boy called Atsuki became the bane of my life. He was your typical high-energy, pure chaos and mischief type of boy. I remember once teaching him in a group. I was wearing a brand new shirt my mum had just sent out. Atsuki wasn't following any of the classroom games with the others as usual. Instead, he had started throwing pencils at me any time I looked in the opposite direction, and occasionally he found the chance to poke one of the pencils in my bottom. I did my best to get through the lesson plan with the rest of the class though. At one point, I hunkered down to make sure I had eye contact with the children to explain the next game. At that same time, Atsuki had somehow grabbed a pair of scissors from a high shelf behind me. At speed and with some skill, considering they were not great quality scissors, Atsuki sneaked up behind me and cut a long open line going up the back of my shirt, even drawing a little blood as well. I had a brief moment of panic before rushing to grab what we called the panic phone on the wall of the padded room. This phone was our only lifeline in the kids' classes. It connected me directly to the Nova reception desk. Within minutes, our branch manager, the fearsome Miyuki, had entered the classroom with me to shout or soothe in Japanese and to save me. Then there was the voice room. Voice room was just for conversation, and a teacher simply entered an open room with coloured square seats with no backs to sit on. Students then randomly wandered in, and it was down to the teacher to entertain the students with games and speaking activities. But often higher level students would tell you stories and speak about their lives. In the bigger cities with lots of young students, voice room could also be a bit of a matchmaking / speed dating style service. And that was working at Nova in a nutshell. Mostly 20-something teachers just about teaching English. We worked pretty hard, got 2 random days off, and were jealous of those on the JET program with their cushy numbers. Next episode we should finish the Nova story, along with my own part in it and that of Chairman Nozu.